The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is an organization of 30 member states, which defines itself as an organization of democratic, developed countries, and it is designed to implement further cooperation in economic policies between the member countries. Israel is very keen to join the OECD because that would be an act of legitimation of Israel by the international community. The OECD, by accepting Israel, would be whitewashing many of the crimes committed by Israel. It would be accepting and legitimizing Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and even turning a blind eye to Israel's apartheid policies. In fact, by allowing Israel to join the OECD would lose the ability to call itself an organization of democratic countries, and would in fact, and every country of the OECD would become complicit in the crimes committed by Israel. The main meaning of Israel joining the OECD would be that the borders of Israel would be accepted by the OECD and by a very significant proportion of the international community, even though these very same borders are not acceptable by international law. It would mean that the OECD would accept a country whose borders are not defined. It would mean that the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would, as well as the Golan Heights, and of course including East Jerusalem, would become a recognized part of Israel, of the Israeli economic sphere, although the Palestinians living in these areas would be erased. They are not considered to be members of the Israeli state and not considered to be members of the OECD. And there were three main issues which Israel had, three main obstacles which Israel had to overcome in order to become a member. The first was relating to anti-bribery laws, because Israel allows its companies, and especially weapon companies, to use bribery as a way to advance its sales of military equipment. Second is the issue of intellectual property rights, especially regarding drugs, pharmaceutical developments. And the third is the issue of the borders, which is the main issue. Israel was mostly able to overcome the first two barriers by changing some of its legislation, by convincing various committees in the OECD that it is taking steps to reduce the use of bribery and the violations of intellectual property rights, but the issue of the borders remains unresolved. In effect, what it means is that Israel controls the entire territory of the Palestinian occupied territories as well as Israel, where about 11 million people live under Israeli control. But only 7 million of these are Israeli citizens, and only 7 million have the right to vote in the Israeli parliament. The remaining 4 million are people who have no rights, no citizenship, and yet they are subjects of the Israeli rule. And what the OECD basically is allowing is that the very same view of the Israeli government, that the entire territory belongs to Israel and is under Israeli control, that only Israeli citizens are to be counted, and that Palestinians are somehow ignored and not included in the official statistics, this view is completely accepted by the OECD. The OECD is willing to use the statistics provided by Israel that apply only to Israeli citizens and to ignore 4 million disempowered Palestinians. Activists in OECD countries who care about international law, who care about human rights, who care about justice, should be very concerned by Israel's joining the OECD, because it means that their own countries are signing documents that recognize the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, that ignore the apartheid regime enforced by Israel on its own citizens and on its subjects, which are not citizens. It means that these countries become accomplices of Israel's crimes. Right now, when Israel is charged with very serious crimes, war crimes as well as crimes against humanity, by the report commissioned by the Human Rights Commission, known as the Goldstone Report. And Israel refuses to investigate the allegations made in these reports and refuses to address them. And there has not been a trial yet by an international court of the crimes committed by Israel during the attack on Gaza between 2008 and 2009. So as long as this issue has not been resolved, accepting Israel into the OECD is very dangerous. It means that war criminals, that perhaps criminals who are guilty of crimes against humanity would become members of a very prestigious club of developed countries, while their victims would be excluded. So that is a very dark stain on the moral sheet of any country that votes to include Israel in the OECD. Israel is very close now to become a full member of the OECD. Right now, Israel has offered a proposal which the OECD seems to be accepting, which is that while Israel will continue to send its reports based on statistics that include the illegal settlements in the West Bank and the Golan Heights, and it continue to ignore the Palestinians, the OECD would add a little note to these reports, saying that the data that applies to the settlements in the Golan Heights and the West Bank and East Jerusalem does not represent a political decision of the OECD regarding these territories, which means that they recognize there is a problem, but they're not going to do anything about it. And Israel would be committed, as part of its accession process, to provide more detailed information after it becomes a member, where it has to separate between the legitimate international borders of Israel and the occupied areas. However, as soon as Israel becomes a member of the OECD, it has veto rights within the OECD, and in fact it will not be required to do anything unless it wishes to. And that is something that is well recognized within the OECD itself and apparent in the OECD reports. So they are trying to find a way to appease Israel and to accept a position which will be the same position that Israel will continue to accept even after it becomes a member. In other words, the OECD is trying to pave a way for Israel to be accepted with the occupation, with the apartheid, with the violations of human rights. Next month, in May, the OECD Ministerial Committee will make its final vote whether Israel will or will not be accepted as a full member of the OECD. So Israel is very close to become accepted. Activists in every OECD country who are concerned about their country voting to accept Israel as a member of the OECD and what it means to the policies of their own country and to their own standing and also to their own conscience should try to contact their representatives and ask parliament members to raise queries in parliament to their foreign ministries in each one of the OECD countries and ask the foreign ministries, what are you going to vote in May? Would you be willing to accept a state without legitimate borders as a member of the OECD? Would you be willing to legitimize Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories by adding Israel to the OECD? Would you be willing to overlook Israeli apartheid? Ask these difficult questions so that Israel will be made accountable for its crimes. We only need one country to vote no in order to block Israel from joining the OECD.